Welcome to Environmental Law Explored, a podcast series, the podcast of the American Bar Association section of Environment, Energy, and Resources. SEER is a member organization whose mission is to foster the success of a diverse community of environmental, energy, and resources lawyers, advisors, law students, and decision makers, and provide a premier forum for the exchange of ideas and information.
Welcome to this series of the Leadership Development Program of the American Bar Association section of Environment, Energy, and Resources, looking at the first 50 years of the Environmental Protection Agency, including the development and evolution of tribal relations when it comes to matters of environmental protection in Indian country. And a very warm welcome today to our listeners and to our very special guest, Dr. Martin Topper, who was National Indian Program Coordinator at EPA for 7 years, during a truly pivotal moment in development of a federal Indian policy pushing toward a recognition of tribal sovereignty and self-determination, especially at EPA when we saw in the 1980s and 90s implementation of treatment as a state, the General Assistance Program, and eventual establishment of the American Indian Environmental Office, and much more.
My name is Martin Topper. I'm retired right now, private consultant in Daytona Beach. I was EPA's National Indian Program Coordinator from 1987 until 1994.
And can you give us a brief overview of your time as National Indian Program Coordinator? I'm curious a bit about how you came to the position, how you rose, I should say, to the position, what your experience at EPA was during that time.
Well, it's kind of interesting. I came to EPA as the Indian Program Coordinator. I came from the Indian Health Service, Navajo area office, where I was the Assistant Director of Mental Health Services. I've lived approximately 12 years on or near Indian reservations. I originally went out to the Navajo Reservation in 1969, pre-doctoral work. I did a doctoral dissertation on normal, everyday Navajo family life and of a traditional family. And then I went on from there to postdoctoral work in mental health, American Indian Affairs, and then joined IHS. EPA was looking for somebody who had some experience in Indian country to be their first full-time Indian program coordinator. I volunteered for the job and fortunately got it.
That's quite a transition from working on the issues you were with health and then into environment. What was that transition? What did that transition involve?
Well, I just figured I was working with mental health, so I'd add environment. And it would be environmental health, and that would take us into EPA. But all kidding aside, I had taught as a professor at Southern Methodist University for 3 years, and 5 straight semesters I taught human ecology. And so I was very interested in the relationship of people to the land. In fact, my daily life in the Navajo traditional family dealt with the interaction of the tribe and the environment and the seasons and the various methods of subsistence. So that's where I came from. And it was a cognitive psychology study. And I realized that the boundary between the conscious and the unconscious was something that was preventing us from getting a complete understanding. So what I did then is I went into the mental health field and looked at the unconscious mind and looked at various motivations around decision and wound up working for the Indian Health Service. Since during the process, I had developed a taxonomy of the traditional Navajo understanding of mental illness. And I then compared that to the current diagnostic manual at the time and realized that there was an interesting interface there. So I began to work in that area, and I worked in that area for 9 years, at which point the tribe was interested in taking the program over, and I went over to EPA because I support self-determination, and I thought, well, I'm not going to go back to academia. I'll go on into government further and spend my career in government.
And that's an excellent point, because you're talking about what was a truly transitional period in the development of federal Indian policy, moving toward promotion of tribal sovereignty with the Nixon and Reagan Indian policies, when you had more of a top-down, I think, site-based system versus more tribe-driven. Can you talk about what you witnessed during this period? I think EPA could almost be considered a microcosm of what was going on more generally with the federal government and the relationship with the tribes.
Well, interestingly, I was a self-determination grant project officer for a mental health project while I was at Navajo Reservation. So I got to see both aspects. One, the development of tribal skills and skills base and management style and skill to be able to run their own programs. So I knew quite a bit about that, and I fortunately was with a tribal program that was running very well. And then also, as far as self-determination is concerned, the Nixon policy basically set the system running towards more self-determination. Although, there had been Indian business councils since about 1925 when Navajo formed the first one, and then there was Indian Reorganization Act. So there's been a slow, multiple decade process of developing more and more tribal skill base to manage their own issues. Of course, there was one detour that occurred during that, and that was the termination period, in which they assumed the tribes would automatically be able to run it, and prematurely turned a lot of programs over to tribes that didn't have a very big economic base. So I sort of tried to develop the next step in self-determination, which was treatment as a state, instead of trying to wholesale dump the programs on the tribe as they had during termination, or have a more top-down structure as they've had prior to the Indian Reorganization Act.
What was the environmental regulation Indian country prior to this period? You talked about the treatment of the state, but how would you describe, set the scene a bit for us?
Okay, basically, the Bureau of Indian Affairs had run health programs on reservation until the early 1950s, and they provided some hospital care, and they provided some sanitation. They provided some landfills and drinking water and that type of thing. Then Indian Health Service came into being, and a little later they got Public Law 86-121. Which was the Tribal Infrastructure Development Program. And they began to build the infrastructure on Indian land. Indian Health Service regulated that to a great degree because, of course, in the early days of that, EPA didn't exist. EPA comes into existence in about 1970 and basically begins as a program that is working with states, not so much with localities, and tribes were not very clearly defined under that until about 1983 when you had the Reagan policy, and then you had the EPA Indian policy come along after that about a year later, and that was developed largely by a fellow by the name of Lee Price. He did a lot of that. He was an EPA lawyer. So what we did was then look at what we could do to develop a program that would meet tribal needs, which wouldn't be the same as the delegation programs that we developed with states, but in which we would try to help tribes develop their own capacity and, first of all, their understanding of what modern environmental regulation meant. So one of my main jobs when I first came on board as a coordinator was to approach the headquarters programs and develop training for tribes because they had already begun on the process of developing tribal programs, tribal set-asides under various environmental media laws. And we wanted to go out and train the tribes to understand what it was that we were doing for them so that we could then go ahead and get them to really see what it took to regulate the environment. But when it came to treatment as a state, we made that a very flexible program. In a delegation program with a state, they usually take on the whole program. And then states really have a lot of resources compared to tribes. They have their own environmental protection agencies, but they're sort of like mini EPA. And what I wanted to make clear to the tribes through this training was that they didn't have to take and create mini EPAs on every reservation because there was such a broad range of reservations. Everything from reservations that were less than a square mile to the Navajo Reservation, which is about 16 million acres and the size of West Virginia, to Alaska, where you have 220 native villages and 44 million acres. So it's a real sense that we were going to try to make the programs as accessible to the Indian tribes through either, grants under the General Assistance Act as it later developed, or grants under the Program Act, or through the creation of tribal consortia. Some of our Western Indian coordinators came up with the idea, said, well, we have so many tribes in states. How can we have, how can the agency fund a full EPA in each one? And that's really not what we wanted to do. We didn't want the tribes to copy us. We wanted them to develop sort of like the next stage in what could be done based on what their real needs were. And part of treatment as a state was to develop the capacity to see what your needs were, because there were some areas that, they just didn't have on certain reservations. In some of the western states, for example, they might not have needed an air program, especially for the smaller tribes, but they may have needed a drinking water program very seriously, because 95% of the Indian drinking water came from the ground, which was on the land within their jurisdiction. So we try to be sensitive.
That's an excellent point. So very much not a one-size-fits-all with treatment of the state. It sounds like you're going for something a lot more flexible. And I'm curious,
Right.
because you mentioned that there's quite a distinction between one tribe's needs and capacity compared to another. What were the major environmental concerns in Indian country that you were seeing, or the range you were seeing at the time? You mentioned drinking water, for example.
We saw concerns everywhere. Under 86-121, IHS, for their funding, had a priority system. Drinking water was their first priority because that spreads disease. Mm-hmm. Sanitation was another one, basic sewage treatment or disposal in septic tanks and things like that, because that's level 2. If you have bad water, everybody's going to get sick. If you have bad sanitation, a subset of people will get sick, depending upon which part of the sanitation system is broken down. And then if you have solid waste, that really became an issue very late in the program, because what was happening is the IHS programs had all been about managing bacterial disease, managing viral disease, and now Indian people were living longer. Indian people, their life expectancy has expanded greatly over the years, not only their population, but their life expectancy, and you were beginning to see cancers. For example, in Navajo, we had groundwater contamination due to background radiation. That was a very serious concern because there was so much radioactivity on the reservation, where they've had, especially in the areas where they've had the uranium mines. Solid waste problems, it's kind of interesting. You can kill a bacteria with fire. You can fairly well neutralize viruses with soap and water. But how do you go after ions that get into the drinking water and cause cancer? Suddenly we're beginning to look at a very, very much more small and sophisticated problem, because once you get into ions, chemicals break down in the ground. That's what landfills are supposed to do. They're supposed to, let them biodegrade. But unfortunately, they don't, especially when you have household hazardous waste, they always don't degrade into materials which are safe to get into the drinking water. And then the question is, do you have to move these solid waste facilities? Do you have to line them? What's the percolation rate in the various areas? And that's basically what we were beginning to look at. For example, if you go to Alaska, and the time I was in Alaska, well, I had actually visited there once, but the time I was Indian coordinator and was looking at the Alaska programs, what was really very interesting is the pattern of hepatitis in the Alaska Native villages, which turned out to be that they had surface landfills, and many of the houses had porta potties. And they would put the bags of waste into the landfills, and the dogs would get in, family dogs would get into the landfill scavenging for food. They would occasionally step in a bag of waste, or the bags of waste would open up, and then they would bring the viruses back into the home, where they would stay in the homes of their masters, and the children would crawl on the floor. Children were getting hepatitis and then passing it on to adults. Now I've been told by EPA, I've had just a few brief conversations with them in the last few months, that the other issue there now is also getting chemicals in those landfills. And it's not a winter problem where the dogs bring the waste in. It becomes more of a summer problem when the permafrost thaws. And then if they use groundwater sources, for drinking, all of a sudden what you've got is pollutant toxic materials. And so it seems to be viruses in the winter and toxics in the summer. One of the things there IHS has been trying to do, and I think EPA was beginning to do some of it when I left the Indian program, was look at helping them develop sanitary approaches, landfills, manage household waste. And I believe that one of the recent EPA funding laws has been changed so that the general assistance money can be used in Alaska for that purpose of managing waste that goes into landfills, because the population up in Alaska has grown from about 90,000 to about 130,000. Now, I told the current Indian program head that I assumed it was about 130, and he said, you're just about at it. So again, we have increasing population density, putting even more pressure on the problem to get it solved, to get it taken care of.
It's really interesting that more and more we're talking, including the mainstream media, about these basic sanitation and drinking water issues you mentioned. So it seems definitely that these are, as I mentioned, perennial issues. And I want to pivot a bit because you mentioned a few specific programs. I'd like to know if you could get a bit more depth to provide some background, especially for listeners who aren't quite as familiar with them or not as familiar with the origin. You mentioned tribal set-asides, treatment as a state, quite in-depth, general assistance program. Would you be able to touch on one or two of those that you think that you would like to see more people be just informed about?
Okay, one of the issues I had early in the program when we were working on tribal set-aside was how much should we set aside for tribe? How do we make sure they get that? And what I did was I looked at the 14th Amendment with equal protection under the law. And I said, well, these are all U.S. citizens. They're all entitled to equal protection, and that should mean we should spend an equal amount of time on each tribe as we spend equal amount of effort and an equal amount of money for tribes. We couldn't spend it for each tribe, sometimes a consortium, to basically represent the amount of money in the program that would be equal to what their population bases are. So I said that's the important thing. As you distribute this out into the regions, you see how many tribal people you have in your various regions and try to get a grant program going with enough money to fund some programs in every region where you could provide some kind of assistance, let's say under the Safe Drinking Water Act. And of course, it would have to be an area where you'd know the tribes had problems with drinking water and drinking water sources. And we worked very close with IHS on this. So we were, in effect, trying to supplement with some of what they were doing, but we were also doing it in a regulatory way. And IHS was doing a lot of the regulation at the time. Their environmental health program was trying everything it could to keep these all up to federal standards. And one of the things I did explain when it came to solid waste was that we had a meeting in front of Congress, and I was asked specifically by Mr. Inouye what some of the problems were, why so many were out of conformance and or compliance. And I said, basically, you have to understand all of the programs out there and all of the facilities out there were in compliance at the time they were built, but it's a moving target. Compliance regulations and requirements were much higher now, so that we have to revisit the whole thing. And he sort of understood, at this point, what the magnitude of the kind of problem that you deal with when you do regulation. In addition to what IHS has done in regulatory affairs, I had followed the Indian program just a little bit after I left. And I learned that the states were working some with the tribes, but that EPA was doing a lot of direct implementation. In other words, EPA people from the EPA offices were spending considerable amount of time from the regional offices looking at the tribal programs and checking for compliance, which was very important, and working hopefully through the general assistance program, which we got people on the ground, and I think that program now is about $60 million or so, I've been told, to work with their counterparts to try to get a good handle on the compliance issues. So that's the way I think they're working now. But our dream was to sort of get some money to the tribes, get some training out among the tribal people so that they could interface with the regional people, and that's one of the reasons we had the state programs. And then we created a program, a fellow by the name of Bill Wilcox and I, under Mr. Sanderson, we created a program called the Senior Environmental Employee Indian Program, in which the EPA federal agencies always have limits to their travel budgets. And we also have limited time to travel, because when you coordinate a national program, you really can't be out in the field all the time. You can be out certain times, but not all the time. So we hired some retired people who were allowed to be rehired by the government, either former government employees or non-government employees. And they could travel to the reservations to talk to the reservations and be sort of like ombudsmen between the reservations and the regional offices, so that they would coordinate efforts as closely as they could. It was really a matter of taking different matrix programs. Tribal administration is a matrix type program. Even though they're not very large matrices, they're still matrix programs. IHS is a matrix program. EPA is a matrix program. So you've got 3 Rubik cubes out there, and you've got to line up the similar colors to get all those in a line so there's good communication back and forth. And that was a lot of what my job was.
And making sure you don't mess up the other sides while you accomplish one.
That's right. Because they'll say, well, wait a minute, we've got to go do this, or we've got to go do that. And say, okay, but you also have to do this, so you need to apportion your time.
And this brings me to, it's one of the final questions I have, which has to do with outreach, which I understand you really saw a big shift during your tenure. What would you say are the top 1 or 2 ways and how outreach really changed between the federal government or EPA specifically working with tribes?
Well, you can say the federal government because I and some other people from other agencies went around and visited other agencies about their programs. We didn't only reach out to IHS and BIA, we reached out to HUD, we reached out to Energy, we reached out to Interior. We were really connected at the headquarters level. We would have regular meetings and developed a 4-party memorandum of understanding between HUD, BIA, EPA, and IHS to promote cooperation between our bureaus. But on the more specific tribal level, the C program was one important thing that we did. In addition to the C program, what we did was we had these regional tribal meetings, and they would be topical, and we would work the meetings through the intertribal organizations for those regions, like the All Indian Pueblo Council or the Northwest Indian Fisheries Commission. We'd also work through the National Congress of American Indians on a national level to keep making presentations to the tribes. One problem we had in all of these matrix organizations was turnover. So you had to have a continuous program of outreach and training in order to make up for the turnover. And it could be quite rapid. I mean, I stayed with the Indian program for about 7 years until we developed the Indian office, at which point I, went another way in EPA, simply because you don't turn over a program to a group of people and then hang around and tell them how to run it. It's not very good. You really need to have one leader. It was going to go under Terry Williams, who was a tribal leader. And that, I think, was an important element that the previous team should back out and let the new team take over because they had even better connections with the reservations than I did. Terry was an environmental manager over at Tulalip. That's the way we approached the program while I was there.
And you mentioned the American Indian Environmental Office, which was, sounds like quite a bit of an innovation. Any major historical milestones in the development of that office?
Yes, it was. What had happened is that before I came to EPA, there was a part-time Indian coordinator out of the Office of Federal Activities. But it got to be that there was a high enough profile. We started out where we'd had pilot projects with 4 tribes when I came in. By the time we left, we were working with over 300 tribes, either individually or as tribal consortia. Our amount of money that we had spent in the beginning was about $4 million on tribes. By the time I left, the Indian coordinators and myself and all of the media program staff and the redirection that we did with the new regulations for the reauthorized laws, we're putting out about $35 million a year in Indian country to support tribal programs in one way or another. With the coming of general assistance, there would be more money coming down the pike in addition. So what really was important at that point was that a structure be created, and Carol Browner was very much in favor of this, that we could create a structure that would go further than what we'd done, what would centralize more and raise to a higher level of visibility Indian programs within headquarters, and would give a little more steam, and power behind the office to negotiate with the other offices on an office-to-office level. And that was a really very important thing to do. At that time, of course, I had chosen to leave. Most of us who had been running the program out of OFA did not go with the Indian program. And we went on to do NEPA types of things, so I kind of lost track at it. From what I could tell, having to go on to various meetings, they had maintained a higher profile within the agency, which I think was important. The other thing that we did is, while the agency had guidance, we went ahead and obtained the right under myself to include tribes. It always had been state and local, actually, and we got them to go state, local, and tribal programs under every area of the agency guidance where it was appropriate. And they, of course, stopped having a guidance after a while and went to a different kind of planning. But for those few years that they did have it, I think that really made a dent in the program, because people would now know that they would be called to account if they did not deal with states, localities, and tribes as stakeholders. And treatment as a state was, again, there were some tribes which wanted to call for treatment as a tribe. And basically, those of us who were in the administration in the program said, if you called it treatment as a tribe, it would be sort of a kind of a left out entity. And what you want to do is treat them as a state, because if you had treatment as a tribe, it would sort of, not only would it be left out, but it would be a real problem for the headquarters people to try to understand that they have to shift and work in two different worlds with the same pot of money. We really did want them treated as a state, or substantially as a state. The other thing about treatment as a state, too, was that these are tribal jurisdictions, and there were bound to be, and we realized that during the program, there were bound to be differences in state and tribal programs, especially in those media where you have transported pollution, like in air and like in water. When you're supposed to deliver water that meets the regulatory standard at your boundary, at your downstream boundary, so that your neighbor isn't automatically out of compliance. And what we did was look at the various tribes that had water programs, surface water programs. A lot of them did irrigation farming, and try to ensure that if it came to be a difficult situation, the tribes would have equal standing to the states. The tribe treated as a state would have equal standing of the state in federal court, so that if it really got to the point where they had to work out their differences in court, at least the tribes would have good standing. And that was a very important point.
That really is an excellent point. And all this background you're providing on set-asides, general assistance program, treatment as a state, really is important context for practitioners like many of our listeners who work with these laws and programs and regulations on a day-to-day basis, but didn't until now have the context on why and how they came to be. And I just want to pivot a bit more, since we're wrapping up right now. Mm-hmm. So you're bringing us to the mid-90s or so. Do you have any reflections that you want to share on where we are right now and looking toward the future? Because there's been quite a bit of progress, but there's ways to go, it seems like.
In the future, hopefully more tribes will desire for treatment as a state. Right now, I was told that we don't have any that have applied for it, although they're working well on direct implementation. I would like to see in the general assistance program, and this is personal, obviously everything I'm doing here is not representing EPA. I'm representing, my own opinion. I should have probably said that as first. But basically what I would really like to see is tribes doing some more of a part of the direct implementation. In other words, the agency is doing some. I would like to see a solid link made to where people who are getting grants under the Indian General Assistance Program would actually be providing regularized feedback to the regional office, and also perhaps to the national office as well, on how they can work more closely together. Because some tribes now are developing industrial complexes, and there's going to be a myriad of other problems coming through, in which they really need to work very closely as the states with the EPA. In fact, later on, after I left the program, I didn't stop doing tribal training. I went over the criminal enforcement program at some time, spent 10 years there, and we had a program where we would reach out to Indian tribes and provide criminal enforcement training and provide the tribal environmental staff with people that they could see from the regional offices where we had our special agent in charge offices, where they could meet with those people and refer directly to them if they believed an environmental crime had been committed. Because we wanted to not only introduce them to environmental regulation, we wanted to introduce them to enforcement and work with the tribal law enforcement officers on that issue.
Wonderful. And I just want to give you an opportunity if there's any humorous or thought-provoking vignette you'd like to share with our listeners. There's always something.
Well, it was a very high-pressure environment, and I don't know how much humor we had, but I think the thought-provoking thing was whenever we went into a region, I do have a PhD in anthropology, and I was at one time an expert in American Indian affairs, especially American Indian mental health. What I think the most thought-provoking issue is you have to be sensitive that these are over 550 separate entities with separate languages and separate cultures. And I only can repeat what my thesis advisor said to me when I went in the field. He said, learn how to be a good in-law.
I think that's the perfect note to end on.
Okay.
And needless to say, the relationship, and we're using relationship in a couple of different meanings here, between the sovereign tribes, as you mentioned, over 550, I think 573 or 74 at this point recognized, and the EPA and the federal government as a whole will continue to evolve in the years ahead. So I want to thank you again, Dr. Topper, for being with us here today. Until next time, this is Cynthia Harris with ABA Section of Environment, Energy, and Resources.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode. To learn more about our section, please visit our website at www.americanbar.org/environ. Please check where you found us for future episodes. Thank you for listening.